This is World Solution Writing Process, Episode 7. This is going to be one of the most linear episodes that you'll ever hear recorded, so it'll be more succinct, more sensible what it's talking about. It's called Managing the Old Regime. Now note that I wrote this in a way to be perhaps managing the regime of an old dictatorship, but you can easily transfer it over to managing the former capitalist regime, just with a little imagination. So, let's dive into it. This section is about the psychological pressures of transforming from being the rebels to being the new government. Revolution requires the skill sets of both disruption and policing. Allies who may have been excellent at disruption may now become liabilities who serve as ticking time bombs within your infant democracy's government or your infant socialist government. A partial change of alliances and personnel may be necessary to keep up with the shifting needs of a revolution's various phases. Every revolution tends to follow a cycle established by Crane Brinton in his classic book, Anatomy of a Revolution, though there are exceptions, in which an initial era of good feelings is followed by a conflict in which the new government has been installed but must defend itself against subversion from within and external attacks. This section deals with the phase in which the initially victorious revolution must defend itself against counterattacks by the old regime and ensure stability against other threats. Subsection heading: Defending the new democracy and the necessity of a post-revolutionary state. Even a government can be defended by crowds rather than arms. Gene Sharp refers to this as civilian defense-based anti-coup defense policy. You can use popular protest to disintegrate the loyalty and discipline of any troops being sent to attack the new democratic government, as Sharp explains in his book, From Dictatorship to Democracy. Quote, "The second basic principle of anti-coup defense is to resist the putschists with non-cooperation and defiance. The needed cooperation and assistance must be denied. Essentially, the same means of struggle that was used against the dictatorship can be used against the new threat, but applied immediately. If both legitimacy and cooperation are denied, the coup may die of political starvation and the chance to build a democratic society restored." For example, this sort of occurred against the Kornilov coup against the Russian Provisional Government in 1917, when the discipline of Kornilov's troops disintegrated. However, you can't always consistently stop a dictator's counter-revolution by relying on an all-volunteer, all-civilian effort, nor a capitalist counter-revolution. The organized force needed to prevent the return of the old regime requires large-scale organization, and all large-scale organization requires some chain of command. This means the new government may need to defend itself with the traditional security forces typically available to a government, and not protesters alone. A new government may now need to utilize the very same security forces whom pro-democracy forces resisted while opposing a repressive regime, or which socialist forces resisted while opposing a capitalist regime, in order to defend the new democracy against the old dictatorship supporters, as the old guard predictably launches counterattacks to re-establish the old system. Such security forces may also be necessary to defend the new democracy from the insurrection and subversion of other harmful factions. There is vast historical precedent for young revolutionary governments and young democracies needing to defend themselves against forceful counter-revolution. For example, a monarchist insurgency may sound completely ridiculous, and of course it is, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened in history's main revolutions. Ridiculous things happen among humans very frequently. In the English, French, and Russian revolutions, the victorious changes of government were quickly followed by civil wars in which monarchs and aristocratic lords attempted to retake power. While the elite itself was a tiny minority among the population, they still attracted mass support because the population had been raised and educated with the idea that monarchy and nobility are necessary. In a speech to the National Convention on December 25, 1973, Maximilien Robespierre defined the tasks of revolutionary government as defending itself against counter-revolution amidst the changing and chaotic security situation of a recent revolution. Quote, "It is the function of constitutional government to maintain the republic. The object of revolutionary government is to establish it. Revolution is the war of liberty against its enemies." And as an aside, such a struggle could be nonviolent but still volatile and rigorous. "The Constitution is the government of a victorious and peaceful liberty. The revolutionary government needs an extraordinary activity precisely because it is at war. It, the revolutionary government, is subjected to less uniform and less rigorous rules because the circumstances in which it finds itself are tempestuous and shifting. and especially because it has been obliged to constantly deploy new and rapid resources to meet new and pressing dangers. The principal concern of the constitutional government is civil liberty, and that of revolutionary government, public liberty. Under a constitutional government, it is almost enough to protect individual liberties against abuses from the state. Under a revolutionary government, the state is obliged to defend itself against the factions which attack it. Revolutionary government owes good citizens the protections of the state. In another speech to the National Convention in February 7, 1974, Robespierre explained why sometimes defending democracy requires restraining opponents of democracy, even though such action might superficially seem undemocratic. Quote, "To found and consolidate democracy, to achieve the peaceable reign of the constitutional laws, we must end the war of liberty against tyranny, and pass safely across the storms of the revolution. Such is the aim of the revolutionary system that you have enacted. Your conduct, then, ought also to be regulated by the stormy circumstances in which the Republic is placed. And the plan of your administration must result from the spirit of the revolutionary government, combined with the general principles of democracy. Society owes protection only to peaceable citizens. The only citizens in the Republic are the Republicans, here meaning opponents of monarchy, not the modern American Republican Party, who, if anything, could be compared to royalists. The royalists, the conspirators, are only strangers or enemies. This terrible war waged by liberty against tyranny, is it not indivisible? Are the enemies within not the allies of the enemies without? The assassins who tear our country apart, the intriguers who buy the consciences that hold the people's mandate, the traitors who sell them, the mercenary pamphleteers hired to dishonor the people's cause, to kill public virtue, to stir up the fire of civil discord, and to prepare political counter-revolution by moral counter-revolution, are all those men less guilty or less dangerous than the tyrants whom they serve? The point of these Robespierre quotes is not to scare you into thinking that all revolutions equals heads getting chopped off, but instead to point out a fundamental task of new governments. They frequently must prepare to defend themselves from immediate counterattack by whatever system they overthrew, whether monarchy, dictatorship, a corrupt party, a foreign occupation, capitalism, or whatever, as well as from other various illegitimate rebellions which are separate from the old regime. The former monarchs and dictators usually just don't disappear after being deposed. They often try to orchestrate schemes for their reinstatement, which must be stopped. The same applies to capitalists and the wealthy as well. A recent example of the need to engage in such political repression to defend democracy is the legal consequences faced by Donald Trump and the January 6 rioters and co-conspirators. The consequences may seem heavy-handed, but no consequences might encourage a repeated attempt. A young democracy may also need to defend itself against rebellions which are not so much attempts at counter-revolution as much as overtly and irresponsibly idealistic. On his way to taking office, George Washington wrote to Henry Knox, "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied with feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." End quote. A possible reason Washington felt this way was because he would henceforth be the one responsible for repressing all future rebellions after recently leading a massive rebellion himself. It's truly unenviable position which any successful revolutionist will nonetheless have to occupy as well. Some modern commentators, including anarchists and other anti-capitalists, glorified the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion as some kind of continuation of the American Revolution, but this is based on the erroneous notion that a post-revolutionary situation could or should immediately revert to pure statelessness. The new American government was correct to repress these rebellions for being a threat to the greater freedom afforded by the new revolutionary state, which of course would be incapable of satisfying the anarchist insistence on pure individual freedom or statelessness, an insistence which cannot be reasonably satisfied in material reality. Washington wrote about opposing Shays' Rebellion in a later letter to Henry Knox. Quote, "If 3 years ago any person had told me that at this day I should see such a formidable rebellion against the laws and constitutions of our own making as now appears, I should have thought him a bedlamite, a fit subject for a madhouse." End quote. The old revolutionary tradition will suggest defending the new state with soldiers and police, whether newly formed forces, grandfathering in the old forces under a new allegiance, or more typically a combination of both. The more recent nonviolence tradition emphasizes defending the new government with a civil approach, involving rallies to support the new government and protests against coup attempts. Wisdom would be a full spectrum approach, with a new democratic government or new socialist government defending itself from counterattack using both civil methods of protest as well as state security forces. Subsection heading: removing loyalists to the old regime from the bureaucracy. Some of the personnel of the old regime may still be lurking in the state administration, which nominally serves under the new democratic government or new socialist government, but who may still have an agenda of their own. Loyalists in the state administration and security forces may secretly sympathize with reinstating the old regime or imposing some new tyranny, and may need to be counteracted and removed. A number of measures can be taken to counteract this possibility. The new government can appoint new heads of agencies, departments, and ministries who it knows to be loyal to the cause of democracy or socialism. The new government can observe and test their loyalty by gauging whether they obey the new rule of law only in words or also in deeds, which can involve both simply observing their political actions as well as electronically surveilling their communications if they are enough of a risk. The new government can appoint into government some former participants in the resistance against the old regime if possible. So, to clarify, I just said it should appoint into the bureaucracy. The new government can appoint into the bureaucracy some former participants of the resistance against the old regime if possible. So, the people you're putting in your state bureaucracy should be people who were part of the revolution. That ensures the political stability of the new system, and that the bureaucracy will obey the new political order. To carry out changes of personnel, it may be as simple as the new administration or legislature making appointments and watching them be obeyed. In a situation of greater political instability, it may be necessary to carry out changes of personnel using the assistance of state security forces, civilian protests, or employee rebellions. This may also have to be carried out against any particularly repressive middle managers or police officers of the old regime. Any spontaneous employee rebellions to remove agency leaders still loyal to the old regime should be treated as legitimate actions by the new government, even though such action might technically be illegal under ordinary circumstances, depending on what kind of new government you're building. The key in removing remnants to the old regime is to avoid the twin dangers of random scapegoating, itself creating new victims who don't deserve to be removed, as well as being too lenient, leaving too many of the personnel of the old regime in place. If you must purge, sometimes it's best to purge in moderation, neither too little to the point of leaving the old guard in place, nor too much to the point of random scapegoating. And to be clear, when we're talking about purging here, we're talking about purging the bureaucracy by firing and removing people, not like chopping their heads off. Different kinds of purges. Subsection heading: exclusion of the old regime from office, elections, and the ballot. Ooh, this is my favorite part. In every electoral system, there is an implicit bias, usually institutionally upheld, regarding the correct spectrum of opinion, which is allowed to participate in the electoral democratic process. This is unavoidable, referred to by sociologist Karl Popper as the paradox of tolerance. If you allow the opponents of democracy to participate in democratic elections, democracy often collapses, as we saw in the case of the Nazi Party exploiting electoral democracy to install a faction which brought democracy to an end. All democracies are managed or guided democracies in practice, with Western democracies frequently being managed in order to prevent the rise of fascist and socialist forces, and democracies outside the West frequently being corrupt democracies which are managed to ensure the rule of a dominant party. In practice, democracies must exclude anti-democratic factions from the electoral process or the democracy implodes. Keeping someone off the ballot and out of elections might seem like a denial of their rights, but the failure to do so might be a denial of everyone's rights, for the risk to their rights which a person's participation in elections may create. In this section, I'm talking about mostly democracy, but in future episodes on multi-party socialism, this same logic which is used to exclude people who oppose democracy from democratic elections will be applied against capitalist parties, excluding capitalist parties from elections on the basis that capitalist parties are vehicles of corruption whose inclusion in power creates an anti-democratic situation. After a revolution against a repressive regime, the new government will have either legislative or administrative control over the electoral bureaucracy, known in the United States, for example, as the Board of Elections. The new order will have to gain enough control over this electoral bureaucracy that supporters of the old regime can be consistently excluded from the elections, keeping them off the ballot. This does not have to be an underhanded activity, but should be carried out openly, not by simple pressure on the electoral bureaucracy, but by executive orders which exclude the old regime from elections, laws passed by the legislature which exclude the old regime from elections, or both. If the old electoral bureaucracy does not cooperate, either a change of leadership within the electoral bureaucracy can be enforced, or a new electoral bureaucracy can be constructed by state action, popular action, or a combination. The mobilized public support of the original social movement, which established the democracy, or the new socialist government, will probably be needed again to secure public legitimacy for excluding the old regime's members from the ballot. After the forces of democracy take power, they must essentially construct a pro-democracy deep state, or a pro-socialism deep state, consisting of both popular or workers' power and state bureaucracy, powerful enough to keep the supporters of the old regime off the ballot permanently. The electoral exclusion of the old guard and other political forces has a long tradition in history. The English Civil War. Royalists had to be repeatedly removed from Parliament to prevent Parliament from collapsing back into support for the king. The French Revolution. In 1973, the more consistent revolutionary Montagnards or Jacobins removed the more conservative, corrupt, and secretly pro-monarchy Girondins from the National Convention, which technically violated democracy, but was done to preserve democracy. Post-American Civil War, the ironclad oath prevented former Confederates from holding elected public office or serving as federal employees. The crises of May 1947. Communist-led incidents of political instability occurred in Italy and France after World War II, after which the U.S. pressured Italy and France to exclude communists from national elections, literally referred to as exclusion crises. Denazification struggles. In 1960s Germany, people had to riot to shut the NDP, successor party to the Nazis, out of politics. Eastern Europe post-communism. In various countries such as Czechoslovakia, Communist Party members and former collaborators were barred from holding government office. And then there's the struggle over whether the old ruling party should be allowed to be part of the transitional government in Tunisia after the fall of Ben Ali in early 2011 in the Arab Spring. Of course, you also have situations in which socialist governments exclude capitalist parties from the ballot, in addition to these more bourgeois examples which I listed. Subsection heading: the spectrum of repression and surveillance. There is a technical distinction between oppression and repression. Oppression is a crackdown which carries a connotation of being wrongful and evil. Repression, on the other hand, is morally neutral. For example, when a corrupt dictator is cracking down on the people to maintain their selfish personal rule, this is evil and is therefore oppression. When the subsequent democracy which replaces that regime places restrictive measures on the former regime and their close supporters to prevent it from being reestablished, this is not evil but necessary, and therefore is not oppression but only repression. This is a key distinction. The same distinction could be drawn towards repressing elements of the former capitalist government from reinserting themselves into government. In a certain sense, repression is a necessary human activity. The world has bad things in it that need to be counteracted, and it's as ordinary as someone keeping insects and rodents from taking over their house and destroying it over time. That's not the same as justifying Stalin and Mao's purges, or the U.S. prison industrial complex, or the war on drugs. To an extent, governments and states are the natural expression of the human social need to repress antisocial behaviors. States can also embody class relations, for example, favoring the wealthy over the people, as suggested by the Princeton study, but this can exist simultaneously with the repression of antisocial behaviors, which would have to be preserved even if the class bias within governments was abolished. The forces of democracy, or socialism, will need to exercise various forms of repression against the former regime, and depending on the situation, a more limited form of repression against the former regime's supporters. The work of detecting threats to your regime is known as counterintelligence, and while it is aimed at detecting foreign spies, it is also aimed at domestic threats to a government such as revolutionaries and terrorists. Most governments, including dictatorships and democracies, whether capitalist or socialist, have a counterintelligence branch. For example, in the USA, the counterintelligence branch is part of the FBI, formerly known as COINTELPRO, which is an abbreviation of Counterintelligence Program. Some similar functions are also undertaken by the type of surveillance engaged in by the NSA. Despite the fact that the democracy movement against a repressive regime will likely have been surveilled and repressed by the counterintelligence service of the old regime, a new political order will need a counterintelligence service as well, especially to prevent the old regime from returning to power. Whether the old counterintelligence service from the old government can be grandfathered into the new political order and possibly renamed, whether the old one must be dismantled and a new one built, depends on the concrete situation. It certainly helps if personnel within the old counterintelligence service swing its alignment over to the revolution during the transition. In some respects, the former regime is like a king too dangerously influential to be allowed to stay in the country. If you arrest them, they'll just use their influence to break out and bribe their way out of imprisonment, like an organized crime gang who own the police, because that's literally what they have the potential to be. Fortunately, the old guard can be largely neutralized by seizing their financial assets, which can be compelled onto the banking system at the behest of the new government, and maybe with some help from the international community for their overseas and offshore assets. Problems can arise if they simply resign but remain in the country. Unless they are exiled, a counter-revolution attempt poses a risk, which would completely shut down our democratic goals. Participants in historic revolutions like the English and French revolutions found that the former monarch was too dangerous to leave alive, and that exile was not enough. Because the king was left alive to flee into exile, the English Revolution should have involved only one civil war, but instead ended up being 3 separate civil wars until the king was finally executed after he tried to reinstate the absolute monarchy multiple times. Similar events unfolded in the French Revolution. Hopefully modern times are more civilized. While understandably angry populations do sometimes execute dictators, as in the case of Benito Mussolini, exile is an alternative to execution against dictators in modern settings. Billionaires, it might go either way. Perhaps their wealth could just be seized and they could even stay in country. Some countries allow that, the Soviet Union, People's Republic of China. Some of them suffered more repression later on. Former wealthy people being subjected to repression during the Cultural Revolution, and whether or not this was actually necessary is debatable. However, imagine overthrowing American capitalism and allowing the wealthy ruling class to flee to another country. Would they attempt to reinstate their rule here from there? It's very possible. So if you can't control their financial assets, it might have to be off with their heads. But maybe seizing their financial assets combined with exile would hopefully be enough. On that point, fortunately, repression is a spectrum, with the following list working its way from the most extreme to the most lenient, with the lower end of the list being preferable, insofar as circumstances allow. The most extreme is execution. The next extreme is imprisonment. The next less extreme would be short-term house arrest while the new government is establishing control. The next less intense form of repression would be exclusion from government and elections post-revolution. The next less form of repression would be containment of protest by supporters of the old regime. Police nearby in case of violence, using riot control equipment rather than lethal ammunition. So if a dictator is overthrown and their supporters start having demonstrations, well, you should have security forces there to contain those demonstrations. If you overthrow capitalism and supporters of capitalism start having demonstrations to reinstate capitalism, you should have security forces nearby to contain those demonstrations. Now, how hard you have to repress those demonstrations, in both cases, depends on what the demonstrators actually do. Do they just stand around and voice their opinion? Do they start rioting? This matters. And then finally, the least heavy form of repression is surveillance. Post-revolutionary governments can practice selective surveillance, in which anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 of electronic surveillance on the total population is eliminated, with electronic surveillance being limited to the most actively violent and disruptive counter-revolutionaries, supporters of the former regime and personnel of the old regime. In overthrowing dominant party systems, it is the entire former ruling party, and possibly the entire old legislature, which must be prevented from reconvening in dominant party dictatorships. That's a Wikipedia entry you can look up. Basically, the summary is there are political systems which are essentially dictatorships, but mask themselves as democracies because they have elections. Most countries these days do. But in their elections, one party always seems to win, and there's a lot of economic rigging that ensures this. So to overcome a dominant party system, there's a whole another question of how you do that and how you have to exclude the former dominant party as you overthrow it. But even the legislature, which was dominated by that dominant party, may be so corrupted by that dominant party that you need to form a new legislature. Any attempt to continue meeting by the deposed government, including its former members and legislators, should be treated as an illegal insurrectionary conspiracy to be surveilled and even prevented by police arrests, because that's what it potentially is. Since the deposed government holding discussions and meetings among itself inevitably leads to attempts to reimpose their old regime. This is true whether the meeting takes place in the original government building, somewhere else, or even online, or over the phone. The old regime could organize its comeback over an online video conference, which is why the old regime must be electronically surveilled. Even small meetings among the old government should be either banned or surveilled and treated as the potential insurrectionary conspiracies which they intrinsically are. Multiple waves of arrests may be necessary in response to multiple waves of meeting and reconvening attempts by members of the old corrupt legislature. It could be a game of cat and mouse for a minute, like the Roundhead campaign in the English Civil War to crush multiple royalist attempts at reorganizing. The movie Cromwell is an amazing film as well, which we may have to watch on loop to psychologically prepare for transitioning from rebels against the old government to defenders of the new government from counter-revolutions. The liberation of the people requires a simultaneous restriction of the movements and communications of the old regime to prevent it from reinstating itself. Democracy revolution is thus simultaneously a great wave of healing and well-being for the majority and also a harsh judgment against the former elite. It is both New Testament and Old. The best neutralization of the former regime may simply be the same sort of impersonal structural oppression they have perpetuated against the people. The loss of their position will definitely be accompanied by a loss of ability to function at a personal level, even if that's not the purpose. The social ostracism they will spontaneously receive from the public without any governmental encouragement will cost them privileges they didn't even know they had. While this cannot be the sole form of repression, with electoral exclusion, public tribunals, and arrest or exile all being necessary, this implicit form of repression rounds out the rest for a full disempowerment of the former regime. However, the organized public narrative crafting of truth commissions is helpful as well. Subsection heading, Truth Commissions. There will have to be Nuremberg-style tribunals against the former regime. Sometimes they are less judicial and more simply for public clarification. In this case, they are known as Truth Commissions. The famous South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, was based on previous truth commissions in Chile and Argentina, and in turn influenced the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Peru. At least 21 countries have used truth commissions from the 1980s to the early 2000s, as reviewed by the documentary Confronting the Truth by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. These countries include Argentina in 1983 and 4, Uganda from 1984 to 86, Chile from 1990 to 91, Chad 1991 to 92, El Salvador 1992 to 93, Sri Lanka 1994 to 97, Haiti 1995 to 96, Burundi 1995 to 96, South Africa 1995 to 2000, and it continues in the form of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Ecuador 1996 to 97, Guatemala, 1997 to 99. You can see there's a lot of global south countries doing this. Nigeria, 1999 to 2001. Uruguay, 2000 to 01. Peru, 2000 to 02. Sierra Leone, 2000 to 02. South Korea, 2000 to 04. Panama, 2001 to 02. Ghana, 2002 to 04. East Timor, 2002 to 05. Yugoslavia, 2002, Morocco, 2004 to 05. The Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the early 2000s, despite being a governmental body, nonetheless organized a fairly political funeral march to establish public recognition of the atrocities committed against the indigenous during the Peruvian Civil War. This is an example of Gene Sharp's concept of new democratic governments using popular civil methods to defend themselves against counterattacks and achieve post-revolutionary stability, as opposed to relying solely on state security forces. In many cases, reconciliation with the former oppressors may feel inappropriate, and either the truth commissions should take a more severe tone, or should be entirely replaced with trials over the crimes of the old regime's personnel. Even the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, only 12% of applicants for amnesty received it, according to the film Confronting the Truth. One key takeaway from the South African TRC was that it focused not only on individual atrocities, but systemic patterns of harm imposed on the majority of the population. In a certain sense, the January 6th congressional hearings were also a form of informal truth commission. Some truth commissions have also sought accountability against the revolutionaries for atrocities by the revolutionaries during the struggle, which are usually much fewer and less severe than those of the regime they opposed, such as in the case of East Timor. This can help establish stability, but also has its downsides. Since the revolutionaries become the personnel of the new political order, it might be better to simply let such matters drop in the name of stability. In a revolutionary era, including both the struggle for change of government and its subsequent period of stabilization, accountability against the former rulers must be increased and accountability against revolutionaries must be decreased, to allow the revolutionaries maximum ability to freely operate and prevail in the conflict against the old order. If anything, the revolutionaries deserve rewards, ceremonies, and parades in their honor. Perhaps a genuine reconciliation process in the sense of mutual amnesty is appropriate between revolutionaries who had conflicts with each other, for the sake of closure and healing, but most importantly for social stability as the former revolutionaries become the new political order. Well, hopefully that was short and sweet. That was World Solution Writing Process, Episode 7 on managing the old regime. Don't we all love a little management? Signing off.